everyone, and welcome to Playwright, a podcast about creating and sharing new ways to play. My name is Ryan Hamann. You can call me H, and my co-host is joining me from the bottom of a cave in the Amazon rainforest, calling it on a walkie-talkie that is being amplified into a podcast receiver. So it's really a great privilege to have you under such trying circumstances.
H, it is wet down here. It is it is humid, and I don't know if I can be saved. I think you should just leave me behind.
I think Elon Musk would be up for it. He's been dying to get into a cave and save somebody for a long time now.
I agree. I think that Elon would have some good ideas as to maybe improve my life down here. I think he could send a charcuterie plate. I think he could do a lot of things.
Flamethrower for whatever it's worth.
Yeah, a Boring Company flamethrower. It's perfect.
Anyways, you do sound a little bit worse than usual. We want to acknowledge up front, but I think that you're going to still be listenable. That's our bar now.
Yes.
Before we get into the video game pitches today, I thought it would be wise to, because we have so many new listeners, to kind of reintroduce ourselves. You know, we can always refer people back to episode 1, but let's be a little bit hospitable. Let's meet them halfway, so to speak.
On July 17th, iTunes user Manif was nice enough to write this review. The title, "What an Awesome Idea. This is the podcast for lonely gamers who wish they had friends to share their crazy ideas with. It's for the creative who feels like they could use a bit of inspiration. I've only recently started listening, and I'm already quite sure this will be one of my favorite podcasts ever." What a sweet review. Yeah. Thank you so much, Manif.
And that is kind of the whole thing, is that, you know, when you and I started this originally, we never really sought this out as a platform for becoming online famous or anything. It's not really about creating entertainment. I mean, it kind of is about creating entertainment. We want to make an interesting show, but more than anything, this was a commitment that we both made to each other to push each other to be more creative and to always be creating things. And, you know, trying to inspire both the joy of creation and also the discipline of creation, of forcing yourself to create something consistently, because as creative people know, it's really hard to trigger that inspiration and to come up with something really novel, especially when you've been doing it for a while and you just kind of feel like you have nothing left, but you are forced to come up with something. So creating a discipline of creativity is a very important part of what we do.
It has helped me over what are we on, 60 episodes or something like that, I feel like, first of all, I'm way better at it now, where I feel like I can whip up something much faster and with much better confidence. And that has only been through over a year now of practice. And, you know, we've said before on the show, and maybe we haven't said it in a while, but these ideas are for free. You know, if you want to go and make any one of these games or some version of these games, don't feel embarrassed. Don't feel like you're stealing something. You know, the ideas are for everybody. We're talking them through to explore and tease out each other's ideas and plus each other's ideas. See what we can add, what we can scope creep and make sometimes into a game that, you know, a team of 200 people couldn't even make.
I don't think that either of us would call ourselves qualified to speak to the game design experience, but just to give a little bit of context as to who we are and why we are on a video game podcast, I thought it would be good to introduce ourselves again. So Q, why don't you give us some background? What do you have to do with video games and who are you in general?
Okay, well, my name's Ryan Quintal. We have two Ryans on the show, and
something we have in common.
I'm a designer, but I do app and website and sort of software design. And I was doing it most recently for IGN.com, which was an incredible experience for me, kind of being at the world's largest video game website and seeing not only, you know, how the sausage is made from an experience of how do you run a website and keep it free for millions of people every day, but also being there during E3 and seeing the whole cycle of, you know, hype and marketing all the way to release, review, support, and all that stuff. And so my background is mostly from a visual design perspective, but I've always had a passion for games since Super Nintendo, and have always wanted to make a game. And so that's kind of how I jumped into this.
Yes, and my name is Ryan Hamann. I am called H on the show. My history with video games is actually starts in podcasting. I worked as one of the panelists on the Cane and Rinse podcast, which is a very slow-paced analytical book club style of podcast that examines one game every week and takes a real in-depth historical dive on it. And so, it'll go through the context of why a game is important, why it was important at the time, why it continues to be important now, what inspired it and what it went on to inspire, and of its place in video game history and where and to what degree it holds up. It's a real thorough look at each video game. And so I came from that very kind of academic type of perspective and worked with them for a number of years. And I'm still an editor on that show. I host the sister podcast, Sound of Play, as well, which highlights video game music. It's a lot more casual. But the reason that I had to drop off mic on Cane and Rinse is because kind of conflict of interest as I moved into working in the video game industry, as I worked as a researcher at Nintendo, doing consumer experience research. And then recently, within the last 4 or 5 months, I moved into a role in marketing. I've been working with Nintendo, structuring our E3 and PAX and Comic-Con and stuff like that, as well as just handling some of the day-to-day marketing of suggesting third-party content for the YouTube and for our social outlets and for other marketing tactics. So we both have different perspectives into the gaming industry. Ryan working in the games journalism side of things, me working in the
publisher, sort of developer publisher.
Right, yeah. And in one of the big three, so to speak. And yeah, anyways, that's who we are. And it's always good to kind of reintroduce ourselves every so often. I guess with that said, we've wasted enough time with the intro. Let's get to some video game pitches.
Let's do it.
Q, would you like to go first today?
Absolutely. From down in the cave, I actually want to pitch, maybe from down in the Hellmouth, I want to pitch you this week a Buffy the Vampire Slayer style MMO / shared world action game. Okay, so you're going to choose sort of at the beginning of the game, like a high school that you're associated with, and then a class, maybe species of vampire slayer, witch, watcher, demon, vampire.
So I'm going to stop you right here because you're mentioning high school vampires and Buffy's the only example you choose to mention. I'm going to remark that there is a very obvious counterexample of high school vampires that might be even more timely that you're very skillfully navigating yourself around.
What's the recent high school vampires?
The very popular Twilight series of books and movies.
Well, this is short. But I'm not going for that stuff. I'm not going for the love and romance. I'm going for the rivalries.
Right. Okay, well, we'll see.
That's true. So, yeah, I figure on this game you go on missions, you fight vampires and demons, and you could even go into underground, into the Hellmouth or whatever, and run dungeons and group activities, level up, earn cosmetics maybe, or something like that. But I think the real cool thing here is special community events that are based around high school things like homecoming or dances or school pride months where each of the high schools that you align yourself with compete against each other for sort of faction rewards and that kind of thing. So for maybe there's fortnightly gatherings and things like that, and you could also collect materials and stuff from creatures that you defeat to make makeshift weapons or fight or cast spells. So, you're a high school student, you don't necessarily have crazy advanced weaponry. It's a matter of breaking chairs and stuff to fashion these stakes to stab some vamps.
Interesting. Well, we'll start the clock there and see where it takes us. So there have been a few vampire-y video games, but it is kind of underrepresented for how popular vampire fiction is in general. Recently we had Vampire by Don't Nod of Remember Me and Life is Strange fame. And previously there was the very highly regarded RPG Vampire the Masquerade, something like that. That sounds about right. Crossing over with this high school setting, which is also weirdly underexplored in video games. It's an intriguing concept. So gameplay-wise, how is this going to be different than the other vampire games? Because, just a aesthetic makeover is interesting, but I want to find out how this really affects, are we going to be dealing with click popularity or is there any meaningful mechanical reason why this is set in high school?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that the high school setting is really more along the lines of the Destiny style faction quests, but Destiny faction sort of events only end up happening every once in a while, like once every 3 months, and then it doesn't even really matter what faction you're a member of. You get to choose a new one each time. This is, you get to pick one high school or another high school or a third high school. You get a school mascot. Maybe that determines the type of cosmetics you could get. And the idea of having these events that are scheduled out and saying, okay, well, it's going to be, Riverdale High, to use a contemporary reference, or Sunnydale, whatever it is. I think that the high school mechanic works more in that way. But yeah, I guess inter-high school cliques or intra-high school cliques is interesting.
So one of the ideas that has been circulating around the Kane and Rince team for a long time, and I'm sure, 100% sure that I've mentioned it on Playwright in the past. I'm not sure if we've built a pitch around it, but we've at least mentioned that we would love to see something like the Nemesis system brought into Rockstar's Bully games.
Oh, yeah.
Where it's all about kind of social manipulation of various cliques and popularity and getting people to turn against each other and growing in popularity and kind of throwing other people under the bus in a very Mean Girls-y kind of a way.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there's room to explore something like that in here. It seems like introducing a mortal element to it, like you would get in a vampire fiction, does kind of throw the balance of power when it comes to clique warfare, as it were. But I'm sure that there are ways to kind of make up for that, make this Revenge of the Nerds, but with supernatural powers. Maybe, are you, the vampires, the only supernatural force in the high school, or are you going to a high school full of monsters from Black Lagoons and Medusas and werewolves and Frankensteins?
Generally, the types of people represented in that Buffy the Vampire Slayer fiction is slayers who are just sort of normal people, but they're very strong and capable. Witches are a thing in that fiction, so these are relatively normal people, but however, they either know how to read the spells and incantations or use materials to cast spells. Watchers are kind of an interesting one. They sort of manage and control vampire slayers. I don't know if they could be represented, but there's also demons and vampires. So I like the idea of, if you go within one high school, you can have let's go really stereotypical, the nerds, the jocks, the cheerleaders, but have each of those groups be slayers and vampires and demons and witches all together. And I think you could have more creature-like bad guys that they all fight. And even each other, in a PvP sort of setting, you can all fight. Yeah, I think it's okay to have, good guy vampires fighting bad guy vampires, because that exists in that world.
I think it's kind of interesting that a lot of these, transformation isn't the word, but these roles are kind of invisible. And so you wouldn't be able to tell necessarily by looking at them who is a witch and who is a slayer and who is a vampire until they get aggressive. Whereas a lot of the high school social cliques are very detectable on the surface.
Right. Now, well, of course, there's something about a vampire genre game that it makes the high school cliques the goths, the goths, the goths, the goths, and the goths. Yeah, I love the idea of somebody being or looking like a sort of harmless cheerleader and then being able to turn the fangs on at any moment in those sort of weird vampire foreheads that Buffy vampires get.
What kind of genre game are we looking at? Like, would this be something that encourages a wide array of multiplayer options? Because that might disincentivize people to play regular humans, which I feel is kind of a natural stabilizing force in these types of supernatural fictions. It's kind of fun to have normal humans to kind of ground the narrative.
Yeah.
But if it's a single player game, then obviously you wouldn't be getting the same kind of PvP and betrayal type of dynamics that you would get in a more unpredictable MMO type experience.
I wonder if one way you could measure faction progress or even quest progress in general is in the show Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I think they have something very grim, like a death count for the high schoolers. And so I wonder if you can get the cheerleaders or the, one of these interfactions or, the vampires or the slayers save the most amount of humans, whether that's weekly or daily or whatever, and run those tallies. And maybe that gives that faction an advantage going into Homecoming or going into the themed dance or themed event. I love the idea of a parent-teacher conference where you're just trying to save the poor parents.
I feel like this is really walking a line here, because if we are setting this in a high school, we're creating kind of a naturalistic setting, which is fun because the fictional elements riff off of that. Mm-hmm. Whereas if we're introducing like frequent death, then that's breaking the rules of a naturalistic setting. Like people would notice if more than one person dies in a school.
Right.
And so it's either we elevate and we go all the way, or we have to play this relatively straight and probably minimize mortality count.
Yeah. I mean, it's so hard to do any sort of shared world anything where no one is really, the jeopardy is low. So how could we make it risky to do these missions or to go out? What do you stand to lose?
There's a lot of vampire fiction incorporates non-lethal options for vampires. Like Dracula visited Lucy, I think was her name in the novel, multiple times, drinking her blood before she eventually died. Whether it's the vampires turning human characters into vampires and serving them, joining their forces, or whether they are just feeding on the humans and the humans get sick or get weaker or something and they can't really explain it. There's ways to still achieve violent ends without reducing the amount of living students at this school.
We haven't really talked about the gameplay. In my head, it's a third-person action game, but I'm not exactly sure what game I could call as an analog, because you almost I can't believe I'm going to make this reference, but I almost think of the Matrix video games in my head, where you see a lot of your character. There's kind of interesting karate combat. Hopefully the moment to moment is more exciting than what the Matrix games are able to pull off. I love the idea of the sort of visceral punches and kicks and combat settings that a high school or surrounding area of a small town could provide.
We're out of time. Let's close the book there. I don't know if we ever reached a real solid idea of what this game would look like, but let's give it a name, throw it back out to the community, see if you have anything to build on top of that.
Buffy the Vampire Slayer came out in the 90s and early 2000s, so I'm going to go with a name that sounds a lot like that and call this Hellmouth Online.
All right, Hellmouth Online. That is a very edgy title.
Yeah, very edgy. We're going to get all those good kids who are into Misery or whatever the heck that game is.
All right, well, my pitch today is probably actually something that you would pitch. So Ooh. I'm going to beat you to it. So this is a city sim that is based in underground caverns in honor of you being stuck in an underground cavern. It's kind of inspired by those Native American communities that you would see in like Arizona, New Mexico, that build their villages kind of on the sides of mountains. And what my idea is that, you know, the Earth is kind of like a hollow cavern, or whatever planet that this is. It's kind of a hollow cavern, and the surface level is dangerous, irradiated, it's uninhabitable for whatever reason, but you can live underground. But everything is supported by these rock piers or these shelves of rock. You have to be very careful because as you want to grow your city, you also have to think about how much weight you're putting on any of these surfaces that you can build on. And so you have to balance population growth with weight distribution and support on these rock formations. So it would cause you to kind of split your priorities between building and creating more structural support. Let's see if we can make this interesting. We'll start the clock there.
Well, you're right. This does sound like something I would pitch. There's an aspect to this. I don't know how heavily you want the game to lean into this sort of aspect of it, but there's an aspect to this that sounds a little bit like the game Frostpunk to me.
Okay, I don't know that game.
So Frostpunk is a city sim that is in essentially post-apocalypse. You're a new ice age, and there's one giant sort of factory left that generates heat, and everybody you have to kind of build out and around it to maintain infrastructure and manage the temperature of your city as you build it out. Maybe the analog to that is the load bearing of different surfaces or something.
Yeah.
It would be interesting if at different points, depending on how you build, there's almost a Jenga-like effect where like moving up structures or upgrading them in some way makes others weaker or able to hold less weight. Like a nicer building is heavier.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I think the thing that I don't want to get out of this is I don't want it to just be like a mathematical equation.
Sure.
Like this piece of rock can support this amount of weight. And so, you know, obviously, if whatever building you're building is going to push it over that number, then you just don't build it. Like that feels like a very binary decision.
Yeah.
And I don't really know a way around that yet. But I'm thinking like the thing in my mind that makes it a little bit more interesting is that weight is kind of constantly fluctuating. As things get more popular, it draws more people, and each person adds more weight. So, you know, it's even, you can't really rest on your laurels. You can't really have like, you can't build your support, build the building, and then just leave it. Like you have to always kind of keep your eye on how much weight is being drawn in one location. And then maybe if something is getting close to collapsing, you have to build a tower of the same type somewhere else to kind of draw some of that attention away.
That's really interesting. I wonder if you could add in a layer that SimCity sort of plays with sometimes, which is neighborhood desirability.
Right, yeah.
Right, so maybe it's more desirable, as opposed to being more desirable to be higher up, maybe it's more desirable to be closer to sort of the core of the planet. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess no, it makes more sense, right? If it being higher, right? Everybody always wants the top floor of a hotel.
Well, I think it'd be interesting if you, as the city planner, could dictate desirability. You know, do whatever you have to do to make a part of the city desirable. Because if you want a lot of people to move there, or if you just want to attract upper crust individuals, therefore kind of thinning the numbers, maybe the way to reduce weight is actually to include more like expensive shops. Therefore, a smaller number of people will buy out more of the buildings. And you know how gentrification usually leads to less population density as people want larger living spaces because they can afford it and they want to kind of have some elbow room, whereas people that are just there out of necessity oftentimes can be packed in really close to one another.
Can you imagine having a system too where, let's say the cavern is not just there's height, but let's say it's almost like a cylinder or a dome even, and you can have sections of population built all around these walls, and some buildings can be supported by counterweight of buildings on the other side. So now you could have like elaborate, whether bridges or pulley systems or something, but you know, this is kind of an interesting social commentary, but you have to keep like the lower class people densely populated in order to counterbalance the weight of these high class high rises. So you're kind of forced to create those types of population sectors to keep the city actually weight balanced.
Yeah, I like that. That's interesting. There would be, I guess, certain structures where like maybe a rock would be balancing on a central point. And so maintaining stability between those 2 points.
And then, I mean, like, you can imagine the campaign, right, is just landing a giant drill on different planets, burrowing underneath, and then finding out whatever random surface you're dealing with and having to build off that.
Okay, so let's add another wrinkle to this. Maybe the most valuable resource in this world, because it's a primarily resource light world to begin with, everything that you need to build is the same rock that you are building on top of. You know, everything is made of stone. And so as you harvest, you are kind of chipping away potentially from some of these support structures. So you might want to dedicate part of your town that is just for resource gathering, or maybe you want to, maybe if you notice a part of town that isn't that popular, that is over supported, then you can start to chip away at that. But I like this dynamic shuffle. The same ground that you are building upon is what you need to build in the first place. Yeah, right.
There's something that feels a little bit more StarCraft almost about that, where like maybe you have the ability to, whether it's something that you upgrade to or just off the bat, you kind of get that data layer that shows, hey, this particular face is very mineral dense. And so maybe you want to harvest this, but it could also be like the most weight supporting, right? Because it's the best rock. So you have to choose whether or not you're going to build your best buildings there and not have to worry about the counterbalance, or if that's where you're going to do your harvesting. That's
interesting. I like this. We're getting into a lot of good like pros and cons and choices that the players have to make. This is going in a good direction.
You picked a good one.
I guess one of the things that I kind of like, I kind of don't like about City Sims is that there's not really an end state. I mean, there's usually some sort of a story mode attached to it, you know, missions that you'd have to achieve. You especially see this in like roller coaster tycoon games and hospital tycoon games and something like that. But in City Sim games, oftentimes it's just kind of build the city you want to build and try to reach economic stability to where you're not hemorrhaging money more than you're taking in. If somebody creates a small town, it is balanced. Like, is that it for them? I guess they would still want to continue building just for the sake of seeing how far they can push it. Bragging rights.
Yeah, I mean, there's always that. But what you could do is just a really, I think, interesting / smart limit is victory conditions could be reaching both maybe a time period, right, where the planet is irradiated for X amount of years. So you have to survive that long as your sort of city is built out. But then the second factor is also maybe you need to continuously grow the population so that once the planet is safe again, you can like successfully repopulate the planet. And if you're constantly putting the like stress on growing the population, then you're always doing more and more complex weight management. So you're giving yourself like increasing logistics to deal with to reach your destination.
Maybe your incentive to grow the population is genetic diversity. If you're trying to repopulate a planet, there's only so much that, you know, a small population can get you before mutations start happening or something. I don't really know. I'm not a geneticist, but
let's call it mutations. That sounds right.
Before inbreeding starts happening. So if you're able to have more genetic diversity, then you have you stand a better chance when you're able to clean up the world and reemerge onto the surface.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, and maybe bring in that Fallout shelter type of system where like refugees from the surface can enter, and you can like encourage parenthood or something as policies and stuff to enact, which I always feel like is a fun, interesting part of any city sim.
Yeah, well, that's all the time we have on that one. Let's give this a name. Cave Story is already taken. Feel like, okay, I want to incorporate cavern into it somewhere. Cavernouscity, where it is literally a cavernous city.
Cavernouscity is pretty good.
That's a fun made-up word. All right, you know what? That'll do. Now we are coming in with a listener submission. This was emailed to us, playwrightcast@gmail.com, from Sidney Leroy, who says, "My name is Sidney Leroy from Bronx, New York. I found this cast after hearing about it on GameScoop and was immediately invested.
Oh.
As a rapper and gamer, I haven't seen the worlds combined as well as I think they could be from a storytelling standpoint. I would love a Square Enix-style RPG with detailed story set in a New York City crime syndicate, the main character being an undercover cop who in his mission is gaining connects on both sides of the law, with two sets of parties that lock independent on which sides of the law you wanted to progress in. These two sets of team's members are unlocked through story progression depending on playstyle, leaning to the by-the-book or the wrong side of the law, which has its own separate few endings, so it's possible to completely miss characters if the right requirements or story progression branch aren't cleared. The parties have their own special buffs and styles based on equipment that they are allowed to attach, so your progression in your own equipment varies based on your playstyle, with deep inventory and customizing modern characters and making sure there is both pros and cons to progressing in either side of the law, so it's really important for players to have to make harder choices of how they approach urban-themed dungeons and get to the bosses and the endings that they possibly would want to see. And with that, we'll start the clock.
Sidney, first I love this pitch. What I really love about this is that fusion of Final Fantasy with an American urban setting. Like, I feel like that... We've seen a lot of JRPGs turn Western, but we haven't seen a lot of Western games do the JRPG thing.
That is interesting. That's kind of surprising, actually. It's like, why haven't more Western devs tried their hand? And obviously there have been... To the Moon is one of my favorite games. That is a Western developed game in a JRPG style of game, but there's no real combat. It lacks a lot of the elements, the gameplay elements that you would associate with the genre. I think one of the interesting touch points that I wanted to bring up here before we get emails is Sleeping Dogs.
Yeah.
Because even though that isn't a JRPG, it was published by Square Enix, interestingly enough. But it is not an RPG, but like a Grand Theft Auto adventure game with some light RPG elements, set in Hong Kong, so a very urban setting, where you are an undercover cop that is infiltrating some gangs, and you are balancing your affiliation between growing in prestige in the gangs and, I guess, being a better cop. Ultimately, the consequences don't really have that great of payout. It's more of that early 2010s way of doing things where it would give you like character progression moments of different abilities if you progress on either of those pathways rather than story payoffs. But, taking that as a starting point and maybe incorporating some of this really cool, like 16-bit revival style that we saw in Octopath Traveler, like I could see an interesting JRPG being built out of this.
I'm so glad you mentioned Octopath because I just started it, but I've been reading and listening to a lot of podcasts talking about it. And one of the things that it seems to be in that game is they allow you to sort of experience every character's story by whether it's stopping or starting or level gating different areas. And I wonder if you could do something like that where you have certain missions or areas of the game where you have to actually have a certain level of affiliation with either the lawful side of things or the criminal underground side of things in order to even have access to those places.
That's one of the interesting things about Sidney's pitch is that in the pitch, there's the idea that you can miss out on certain content.
Yeah.
You can lock yourself away from, and that makes sense. I mean, if you are straddling these two communities and you choose to invest in one and not the other, like that's really interesting. Whereas in JRPGs, I think they at least make it possible to witness everything. I think because they are such time sinks that it would feel bad to invest 200 hours in something and still feel like you're not getting a complete experience.
Right.
What can we do to steer more towards this idea of making meaningful choices and really like locking yourself out of certain, and maybe Octopath does kind of hold the key, because you, in Octopath Traveler, before you can go on the group mission, you kind of have to play as these multiple characters and go through their stories and experience, their backstories essentially. So maybe that's a good way of like gaining empathy on both sides. You have the main character, and then you have maybe side stories where you have to play as various characters you meet during the game and go through little JRPG sub-stories starring them. And maybe, they don't join your party necessarily, but you get to spend some time in the shoes of members of each side. And so you really get to empathize with both the cops and the criminals in this case.
Yeah, I was just thinking a system that seemed like it had a lot of meaning when it was initially pitched and maybe in the first iteration of it, but ended up not having a lot of meaning, I think, was the Renegade Paragon system in Mass Effect.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if, let's say that there's only so many events and choices in the game, and each of them is going to push you towards one end or the other. And of course, this is, I guess, the, carryover from the Knights of the Old Republic games. You take that and you make it so that somebody who is just too far in one direction or another would be instantly recognized as a cop or a do-gooder by by the criminals, or known as being dirty by the cops. And so they aren't actually able to get to that place, because in terms of withholding things, right? If the story is maybe reasonably short, maybe this is a Nier Automata sized game rather than a Final Fantasy sized game.
It's just a game with 26 endings.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, maybe exactly that, right? Because second playthrough, you're going and you're going to, okay, I'm going to make this decision differently and that decision differently. And what does that give me access to? And maybe you do even hide, story quests and gameplay mechanics behind it, and the way to uncover the backstory and the true journey of what your life would be like with each member of both the cops and the criminals is to have those replays, but still be able to carry over, say, leveling progress.
It would be interesting if the difference between the cops and the criminals is kind of the distribution of information almost. They're both kind of diametrically opposed to one another, but there are obviously good cops and bad cops. There's obviously criminals that are going out and performing criminal acts, and then there are just people that exist in the same communities that aren't doing illegal things.
Yeah.
So they aren't criminals, but you see so many stories of racial profiling, especially in America today, of cops shooting down innocent people. And a lot of the tension there is that the police don't know necessarily what happened in a situation when they arrive. I mean, obviously, I don't want to write off many situations in which like genuinely racist, awful individuals know exactly what's going on and decide to murder somebody anyways. That's not what I'm trying to. But, if you are a cop, and if that's the side that you choose to abide by, then maybe you have more of the police's perspective, and you don't know. You show up at a crime scene and you don't know who is dangerous and who isn't. And so you have to react. And maybe if you choose to go with the regular citizens side of thing, then you don't know which cops are to be trusted and which ones are just looking for an excuse to pull out their guns, And so each side has to be defensive. Each side has to potentially be offensive in the way that they encounter the others, because they just don't know what's going on in the other, whether the other side is to be trusted or whether they're really doing their jobs. It's there's some tension there.
I think that's really interesting, and it's almost, you get a Rashomon style point of view of the whole thing of like, well, this is what it was like being on the other side of that very same encounter that maybe initially in my first playthrough, I was part of the raid or the takedown or something like that. And on the other side, I was a person, and I saw that, hey, those people that we hurt the first time through, they weren't even involved. They were totally innocent.
Yeah, the real people that were involved all ran away and left you confused there as the police storm in and point their guns.
Now, selfishly, I would love... Sorry, Sydney, I know this is a New York thing, but I want this set in Boston a little bit, in like a The Departed Scorsese style flick, and to... Like, maybe if you...
That's right, because New York is too limiting a space, you know? It's just... It's so one note.
Well, it's very done. I will say New York is very done.
All right.
Like, it would be really interesting to go all the way down the sort of cop criminal justice side and be able to take down the entire criminal ring, and then likewise, like, go all the way down the criminal side and find out, like... the head of the police is dirty and behind the whole thing, and knew that you were like carrying out his will in, you know, the first 30 hours of the game or the first playthrough, whatever.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time. Thank you again, Sidney, for sending this in. We're going to have to come up with a name for it now. I feel like the pivot towards a different city right at the end there. It's going to make it a little bit difficult to get a firm identity on this, but if we want kind of a non-specific name like Octopath Traveler.
Man, what if you called it something like Criminal Law?
Criminal Law feels like a college course.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's... yeah.
Maybe you do like Sirens and Silence.
Ooh, that sounds more like an RPG. That sounds more Final Fantasy. What are some Final Fantasy subtitles? Are they all just numbered?
Oh, there's like Crystal Chronicles. You do Crystal Meth Chronicles.
Oh, God.
That's pretty bad.
Let's take the direct rip from Final Fantasy and call it something like Final Justice.
Actually, oh, no, wait. No, that's a movie.
Oh.
Final Justice. I was thinking there's already a game, but no, that's a Joe Don Baker movie. That was on Mystery Science Theater. Has one of my favorite sequences in the end credits. Look that up.
Final Justice is too cheesy, I guess. Should we go for it?
Hey, that's fine.
We've done it, everyone. We've talked ourselves into Final Justice.
Final Justice. You better run, or he'll steal your lunch.
I like Final Justice Original. I don't like Final Justice Online.
Very nice. Well, that was emailed to us at playwrightcast@gmail.com. You can also go to our website, playwrightcast.com, or go straight to the pitching portal, playwrightcast.com/pitch. You can tweet us at playwrightcast. Deliver your ideas, your video game ideas in any of these locations, and we will read it on a future show.
Special thank you to PROTODOME for the use of our theme song, Hello World. It's off the album Blue Noise. It's very, very good, and you should go give it a listen.
Yes, of course, PROTODOME's music, as far as I know, last time I checked, is all name your own price on Bandcamp. So you can get it for free. You can get it for as much money as you feel good old Blake deserves. I was just in my car the other day. I had my music on shuffle, and Ham Jam came on, which is a banging track. So keep up the good work, PROTODOME, and everyone do check it out. It is really good music. I like it a lot. Anyways, let us take ourselves out of the show today with a miniature pitch. Q, why don't you give us something small to think about throughout the week?
Yes, let's have a video game where your microphone mixer breaks, and at the very last minute, you have to record a podcast.
It's like a Monkey Island style adventure where you have to assemble things in a room to make a microphone.
Yes, you have to move across the country and assemble a microphone along the way to do a podcast.
I like it. Twist ending. All right. Well, that's it for today. We'll see you next week.
Bye.